What happens when the simple act of closing your eyes could literally be the last thing you ever do? Have you ever been so bone-tired, so fundamentally exhausted that your vision blurs, your hands shake, and your brain begs you to just shut down for 5 minutes? For most of us, sleep is a sanctuary. It is a soft bed, a locked door, and a thermostat set to a perfect 70 degrees. But what if sleep was a trap? What if giving in to exhaustion meant rolling the dice with your own life? Imagine the year is 1926. You're not in a bedroom. You're isolated in the middle of a frozen, desolate wasteland, sitting inside a brutal contraption of cast iron, splintering wood, and cold canvas. You are an early American truck driver, navigating a beast like the legendary Mack AC Bulldog or a leftover World War I Liberty truck across roads that are nothing more than glorified frozen mud trenches. The temperature outside is plunging past minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind is howling like a wounded animal. You have been fighting the steering wheel for 22 hours straight. Your arms feel like lead, your eyes are burning from toxic exhaust fumes, and your body is desperately crying out for rest. But you know the terrifying truth that every driver of that era knew: if you fall asleep in this cab tonight, there is a very real chance you will never wake up again. Why was the simple act of sleeping so incredibly dangerous for these early pioneers of the highway? And what desperate, almost suicidal measures did they take just to survive until dawn? To truly understand the nightmare these men faced every single night, we have to completely erase everything you know about modern transportation. Today, a semi-truck is a rolling computer. It has air ride suspension, heated leather seats, GPS navigation, and sleeper berths that rival small apartments. But the trucks of the 1920s were barely more than motorized wagons. They were primitive, violent machines designed solely for utility, with absolutely zero consideration for the human being operating them. There were no sleeper cabs. In fact, many of these trucks didn't even have fully enclosed cabins. The roofs were often made of stretched canvas, and instead of glass windows that rolled up to seal out the elements, they had side curtains made of heavy, stiff cloth that snapped into place. When a blizzard hit, those canvas flaps would freeze solid and violently whip against the wooden frame, letting in blasts of sub-zero air that sliced through whatever inadequate clothing the driver was wearing. There were no heaters. Let me repeat that, because it is crucial. There was absolutely no heating system in the cab. Whatever the temperature was outside on that frozen mountain pass, it was exactly the same inside the truck, only accompanied by hurricane-force drafts pulling through the floorboards. The floor itself was just wooden planks bolted over the spinning transmission and the exhaust pipe. So, you're sitting in a wooden box surrounded by freezing canvas, gripping a massive, freezing iron steering wheel with no power steering. Every time the truck hit a frozen rut, because there were no paved highways, only dirt paths carved by horse-drawn wagons, the solid rubber tires would transfer the bone-shattering impact directly up through the rigid suspension, through the wooden seat, and into your spine. It was a rolling torture chamber that demanded immense physical strength just to keep it moving in a straight line. But wait, you might be thinking, if it was that cold, why didn't they just leave the engine running while they parked, curl up on the seat, and soak up the heat radiating from the engine block? It sounds like a logical survival strategy, right? Well, this brings us to the first silent killer of the 1920s trucker, and it is a terrifying reality that claimed countless lives. You see, the engines of that era were notoriously inefficient and leaky. The exhaust systems were not sealed with precision gaskets like they are today. They were loose, rattling pipes that constantly spewed noxious clouds of raw carbon monoxide because the wooden floorboards of the cab were full of gaps and holes to allow the clutch and brake pedals to pass through. Leaving the engine running while stationary created a deadly gas chamber. If a driver parked his truck in a snowbank, left the massive four-cylinder engine idling to generate a pathetic amount of ambient heat, and closed his canvas flaps to block the wind, the heavy, odorless carbon monoxide would immediately begin seeping up through the floor. Within minutes, it would pool inside the cab. The exhausted driver, thinking he was finally getting some much-needed rest, would drift off to sleep as the gas displaced the oxygen in his blood. He would never feel himself suffocating. The cold wouldn't wake him up, because the carbon monoxide poisoning would put him into a deep, irreversible coma long before the freezing temperatures could stop his heart. Countless drivers were found the next morning, sitting peacefully upright behind the steering wheel, completely dead, victims of their own engine. So idling for heat was out of the question. You had to turn the engine off. But turning the engine off in sub-zero temperatures introduced an entirely new, potentially fatal problem. If you're finding yourself completely captivated by the sheer brutality of this era, ask yourself this: what happens when you shut off a primitive cast iron engine in the middle of a blizzard, knowing that if it doesn't start back up in the morning, you will freeze to death miles from civilization? This was the ultimate catch-22 of early trucking. When the engine was turned off, the countdown to disaster began immediately. The oil used in the 1920s was not the highly engineered, synthetic, multi-viscosity fluid we have today. It was thick, crude, and highly susceptible to temperature changes. Within an hour of the engine shutting down in sub-zero weather, the oil in the crankcase would begin to congeal into a solid, impenetrable sludge, thick as cold molasses. The massive metal pistons and cylinders would contract in the cold, locking the engine up tight. If a driver slept for too long, the machine would effectively become a solid block of frozen iron. And remember, there were no electric starter motors on most of these early rigs. To start the truck, the driver had to stand out in the freezing snow, grab a massive iron hand crank protruding from the front of the radiator, and physically muscle the engine over. Trying to crank a frozen, sludge-filled engine was virtually impossible for even the strongest men, and if they forced it, the engine could backfire violently, snapping the hand crank backward with enough force to instantly shatter their arm or cave in their skull. A broken arm in a frozen wasteland with no medical help meant shock, hypothermia, and death. So how did they solve this impossible mechanical nightmare? The answer is so dangerous it borders on insanity. The drivers would carry matches and highly flammable rags soaked in kerosene. When they woke up, shivering and on the brink of hypothermia, they would crawl underneath the truck into the snow, dig a small trench directly beneath the engine's oil pan, and build an open fire. Yes, they would light a bonfire directly underneath a machine leaking oil, grease, and gasoline fumes. They would sit there in the freezing dark, nursing the flames, watching the metal of the oil pan heat up, praying that the truck wouldn't catch fire and explode, leaving them stranded and doomed. So, you are sitting in a freezing, drafty cab, miles away from anyone, knowing you can't leave the engine running. And you know that if you sleep too long, the engine will freeze solid. How do you actually get any rest? What was the physical ritual of trying to sleep in an environment actively trying to kill you? This is where the human survival instinct takes over in the most desperate ways imaginable. Since there were no beds in the trucks, drivers had to create a makeshift nest out of pure necessity. They would pull their trucks over onto the side of the treacherous dirt roads, usually completely enveloped in darkness because rural electrification didn't exist yet. The moment the engine was killed, the biting cold would immediately begin to seep into the cab. The drivers would deploy their secret weapon, massive stacks of daily newspapers. They didn't carry these papers to read, they carried them for insulation. They would forcefully crumple the dry newspaper and stuff it entirely down their pants, inside their jackets, and into their boots. Paper is a phenomenal insulator because it traps pockets of dead air, creating a primitive thermal barrier against the skin. They would wrap their heads in thick wool scarves, leaving only a tiny slit for their eyes and mouth, their breath instantly crystallizing into ice on the wool. Then, they would contort their bodies across the hard wooden bench seat, trying to curl up as tightly as possible to conserve core body heat. Some drivers, desperate for any warmth, would literally open the hood of the truck the moment they stopped, drape a heavy canvas tarp over the engine block and themselves, and sleep directly on top of the still ticking hot iron engine. They would inhale the overwhelming stench of burning oil and hot grease, risking severe burns if they shifted in their sleep, just to absorb the fading thermal energy of the machine. But they could never, ever sleep deeply. They trained their minds to operate on a hair trigger. They slept in terrified, agonizing 15-minute increments. If they slept longer than that, their core temperature would drop to critical levels, or the engine would freeze beyond recovery. It was a continuous cycle of passing out from sheer exhaustion, jolting awake from the excruciating pain of the cold, checking the engine, and trying to pass out again. It was biological torture. Now let me ask you another question, because the cold and the carbon monoxide were not the only things lurking in the dark. What if you woke up in the middle of the night, shivering under your pile of newspapers, and heard the crunching of footsteps in the snow outside your canvas door? In the 1920s, the concept of highway patrol or state troopers was practically non-existent in vast stretches of the country. The roads were completely lawless frontiers as trucking became more prominent, transporting valuable goods like textiles, machine parts, food, And during the Prohibition era, illegal liquor, the trucks became incredibly lucrative targets for organized criminals and desperate highwaymen. These drivers were entirely on their own. There were no radios to call for help. If you were hijacked on a lonely stretch of the Lincoln Highway in the dead of night, you were completely at the mercy of the attackers. Because of this terrifying reality, almost every single long-haul trucker of that era slept with a loaded revolver or a shotgun resting directly across their chest or tucked right under their makeshift newspaper pillow. They were not just drivers, they were armed guards defending their cargo with their lives. The psychological toll of this constant paranoia was immense. Every time the wind violently shook the truck, every time a wild animal howled in the distance, or every time a tree branch snapped under the weight of the snow, the driver's heart would pound out of his chest, his hand instantly gripping the cold steel of his weapon. They were operating in a constant state of fight-or-flight adrenaline, which makes the fact that they could sleep at all even more miraculous. They were fighting the weather, the machine, and the very real threat of murder, all while isolated in a pitch-black frozen box. Why would any human being willingly subject themselves to this level of agonizing torture night after night? Why didn't they just quit, walk into a factory, and take a safer, warmer job? To understand their resolve, you have to understand the era and the unbreakable breed of men who sat behind the wheel. The 1920s was a decade of massive transition, sitting right between the end of the First World War and the impending doom of the Great Depression. Many of these early drivers were hardened combat veterans who had survived the horrors of trench warfare in Europe. They had already lived through mustard gas, artillery barrages, and freezing in the mud of France. To them, a freezing truck cab was just another trench, another battle to be won. Furthermore, the economic pressure was crushing. There were no safety nets, no unemployment insurance, and no corporate liability policies protecting the driver. If you were entrusted with a load of coal meant for a freezing town in the mountains, and you abandoned your truck because you were cold, you weren't just fired. You were blacklisted. Your family would face starvation, and that town might freeze. They carried a colossal burden of absolute responsibility. They viewed themselves as the solitary pioneers of a new, motorized frontier. They took a deep, silent, and incredibly fierce pride in doing the impossible. When everyone else said the roads were impassable, when the trains were frozen to the tracks, the trucker was the one who fired up his oil pan bonfire, cranked his heavy engine, and brute forced his way through the snowdrifts. They embraced the suffering because they knew that their ability to endure pain was the only thing keeping the supply chain of a growing nation alive. It was a pure, unadulterated display of the human spirit refusing to break. It was the mindset of absolute resolve, a mental fortress where failure was simply not an option, no matter how much the flesh suffered. But let's pivot for a second, because I know you might be wondering, did they just suffer entirely alone? Was there absolutely no sense of community in this brutal profession? Today, truckers have CB radios, satellite communication, and giant brightly lit travel plazas where they can sit and drink coffee together. In the 1920s, the isolation was profound, but it birthed a brotherhood that was arguably stronger than anything that exists today. It was an unspoken, ironclad code of the primitive highway. You never ever pass a broken-down truck, period. It didn't matter if you were behind schedule. It didn't matter if you were freezing yourself, and it didn't matter if you didn't know the guy. If you saw a dark truck on the side of the road in the winter, you stopped, because every driver knew that next week, or even the next day, they could be the one stranded, slowly freezing to death in the silent snow. When two drivers met on the road, they would share their meager resources. They would pool their kerosene to start a fire. They would combine their physical strength to turn the hand cranks of frozen engines. They would share stale bread, half-frozen salted meat, and whatever terrible coffee they had managed to brew miles back. There was no complaining. There was no feeling sorry for themselves. There was only the grim, silent acknowledgement of mutual survival. They were a tribe of steel-driving men who understood that the elements were actively trying to kill them, and the only way to cheat death was to rely entirely on the strength of the stranger, shivering next to them in the snow. They were forging the very foundation of the modern trucking industry, paving the way with their frozen hands, their broken sleep, and their unbreakable will. So, the next time you're lying in your comfortable, climate-controlled bedroom, listening to the wind howl against your insulated windows, take a moment to think about the absolute madness of the 1920s trucker. Think about the man wrapped in crumpled newspapers, clutching a revolver, shivering violently in a wooden box while toxic fumes seep through the floorboards. Think about the agonizing choice between freezing to death, suffocating, or blowing up your own engine with a bonfire. These men didn't just drive trucks. They went to war with nature, machinery, and their own biological limits every single night. They risked their lives just for the privilege of closing their eyes for 15 minutes. Their story is a testament to what the human mind and body can endure when failure is not an option and survival is the only goal. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been so exhausted that you slept in a dangerous or completely bizarre situation just to get a few minutes of rest? Drop your wildest sleep deprivation stories in the comments below. I read absolutely every single one of them. And if this deep dive into the brutal, forgotten history of America's first truckers gave you a new level of respect for the giants who built the supply chain, you know what to do. Smash that like button so the algorithm pushes this untold history to more people, and make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss another journey into the most intense, unbelievable stories of human resolve. Stay relentless, stay curious, and I will see you in the next video.